Wherapy. Therapy wherever, whenever.
Welcome to Coffee with a Therapist, the podcast where you and myself, Philip Andersson, psychotherapist and founder of Wherapy, will delve into the complexities of the human psyche, all whilst drinking a cup of coffee. So grab your favorite mug. Today I've got my Moomin mug with me, and I've got my dog Robinson lying here right next to me in case you hear any sounds in the background. In this episode, we'll be talking about eco-anxiety. I'll be discussing what eco-anxiety is. I'll also talk to you about the psychological and sociological process behind eco-anxiety. And hopefully, I'll be able to give you some practical tips on what you can do to dampen the effects of eco-anxiety. So, grab that cup of coffee and join me for today's podcast. Before I begin, I just want to mention two things. The first thing is that I have a bit of a cold, in case you're wondering why I sound nasally during this podcast. And the second thing is that at the end of the podcast, as always, I'm going to announce the 3 countries for this week's Therapy World Tour. For those of you who don't know, every week I announce 3 countries, and if you're from any of these 3 countries, you can apply to have 1 free online therapy session with me. So, eco-anxiety, what is it? I'm sure that those of you watching this podcast on YouTube or listening to us on Spotify or any of the podcast platforms already knows what eco-anxiety is. Yeah. It's anxiety that is caused by our fear of the effects of climate change. And I think it's something that us working with mental health are seeing more and more recently. I can only speak for myself, but in my practice, I think that the majority of the people that I meet has eco-anxiety to some extent. Yeah. Whereas climate change has existed for a very long time, eco-anxiety, I think, in its earliest form, came into existence in about maybe 2007 when the film The Inconvenient Truth came out in theaters. I remember that it scared a lot of people, and I think it was used by a lot of schools as well to enlighten their students about the effects of climate change, but it also caused a lot of anxiety attached to it. However, eco-anxiety has become more and more prevalent in recent years, not least because of social media, but also because of the prevalence of news articles about climate change. And obviously, the prevalence has grown to such an extent that it has gained its own term. Yeah. Previously, we just thought about anxiety as anxiety. And as you heard, probably if you listened to last week's podcast, there are different categories of anxiety nowadays. So we have health anxiety, for example. We have eco-anxiety now, for example. And the typical eco-anxious person is someone who, for me at least, is maybe middle-aged and downwards. I don't think it has a genus aspect to it. It is somebody who is well read, at least when it comes to the news, or is well connected on social media. And with very many things in today's world, it has been hijacked by the political spectrum. So left-leaning people are more likely to be eco-anxious, whereas right-leaning people are actually less likely to become eco-anxious. So that is my kind of profile. In the next segment of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about the psychological process behind eco-anxiety and also the sociological process. And that's why I mentioned the different political spectrums. So stay tuned for that. So, welcome back. In this segment, we're going to talk about the sociological and psychological aspect or process behind eco-anxiety. At the end of the last section, I began speaking about the different political spectrums, and the reason why I did so was that eco-anxiety, as with so many other things, has been hijacked by politics. Now you can't really talk about having one opinion or another opinion without being associated with a certain political spectrum, and then without being kind of pigeonholed in there and then being attacked by the other side, so to speak. And that's obviously such a shame, but it also leads to the eco-anxiety growing bigger and bigger, because we have two camps here. We have the people who are kind of bringing this to the forefront of our minds every day, and they're doing so in kind of a herd mentality way. They're kind of putting up evidence out there and saying, "Oh, look at everything that is happening in the world." And the people who are viewing this, some will be like, some will not want to know that it exists and go on the offensive back and say, "Well, it isn't as bad as you guys think it is," and so on and so forth. And this kind of fuels the fire, I don't think that there are many people anymore who are kind of denying the human impact of on climate change, but we're still in that part of the discussion. Either we are accepting it or denying it, and the side who is accepting it is also kind of obviously backed by news outlets who are also bringing it to the forefront of our minds. And even though and this is not me denying climate change or whatever, but news outlets are also kind of motivated in a clickbaity way, or in a kind of, they're motivated to get people to read their articles, to sell advertisements. So whenever they have a kind of slow news day, or even when they don't, they have a tendency to sensationalize articles, especially headlines. And headlines are almost the only thing that we read. Not a lot of people read to the very end of the article. There's many times where people can kind of see a sensationalized headline, click on it, and then read, and then when they come maybe to the very end of the article, they realize that, well, it wasn't really that bad. What I kind of wanted to say with this was that society has a way of splitting things into camps. If you recall as well, with maybe the COVID outbreak, there was also camps there, either kind of for or against. It sounds very silly to say it, for or against COVID, for or against climate change. But that is the way that kind of society works. Being kind of there in the mid-ground, it's very hard for people to do, because being in the mid-ground means that we're not in any of the herds. And there we're kind of, we got to fight against both sides. We got to stand up for ourselves, and it's a very lonely place to be in. And sometimes when we're kind of very hyper aware of something, obviously, then we join that side who's trying to shout the loudest about our fears, yeah. And then when we're also kind of scared and also a bit tired about receiving all this bad and negative news, then we want to go into the denial camp. So to some extent we jump between the two herds as well. So that's the sociological aspect behind it. And I think the psychological aspect is very similar to what I talked about when I talked about health anxiety a few episodes ago, about since we are so kind of likely to read news, yeah, the profile of the eco-anxious person is somebody who's reasonably up to date, reasonably intellectual, somebody who cares a lot, obviously, about themselves, their loved ones, and the world, and somebody who is obviously happy in life, really. Yeah, they want to continue existing, and then we have this existential thread, yeah. But they have a tendency to scroll, they have a tendency to look at news and search for news, yeah. And they're searching for a lot of news that is going with that narrative that scares them. And the traditional news outlets and social media is very good at providing you with news that suits your views, yeah, and suits who you are, yeah. So they won't be providing you with good news about progress we are making in climate change, because that's not what you're looking after, really. That's not what you're looking for. Yeah? So we have a tendency, and those people, yeah, who are health anxious, to keep ourselves up to date. So then we're looking for things that kind of fit in with our view of the world. Yeah. And this is where it kind of becomes an illness, in the same way as health anxiety becomes an illness, is that we're now we're looking at and this is a sickness that that kind of is in society today, that has come with the development of society, and that is that we have a tendency to data analyze everything, yeah, to get information about everything and to fill in certain patterns, yeah. So when we have something as fluid and as hard to grasp, yeah, as the environment, wherein one day it might rain, the next day it might be sunny, yeah, then it's difficult for us to accept that, yeah. And that is not to say that obviously if it snows in the summer and it's 20 degrees or 30 degrees hot in the winter in some places where it shouldn't, then obviously that's an anomaly that we should be scared of, yeah. But right now we're so used to kind of hyper analyzing every little variant in the climate, in the weather. So if it doesn't exactly suit what is expected, and to be frank, we don't really know what is to be expected, yeah, because we don't have information from that far along in the past, yeah. But recently there was an article about unseasonable autumn winds, yeah, and this was an article at the beginning of maybe the first maybe week or two of August, yeah, and obviously winter is just a few weeks away, yeah. So yeah, if it starts a little bit earlier, a little bit sooner, it shouldn't be that much of a topic. But we as a society now, we have a tendency to hyper analyze and to get every little bit of information down so we know what to expect when. But the world is biological, so it doesn't care about your statistical analysis. And this, since we've become so used to doing that, since we've become so used to gathering information this way, it's hard for us to cope with that. And therefore, every slight change in weather patterns points in our mind to climate change. Reminds us of climate change. So if it happens to be a few degrees warmer one week, then that points to climate change. And if the next week it happens to rain a little bit more, or is a little bit more cloudy, then that points to climate change. If it happens to be a few degrees colder than expected in mid-July or so, then that points to climate change. And unless that everything for a prolonged period of time just ticks the average expected temperature and average expected weather patterns, unless that happens, then we are reminded of climate change. So there's so much that reminds us of that. And going back to the sociological process, there are two ways of combating big societal problems, and that's one is the whip, the other is the carrot. The carrot being the motivation and the whip being the punishment. And now we're a lot in the whip stage. So when we see news about the climate getting worse and worse, and when we see social media, just maybe friends saying, oh, this posting something about it being abnormally hot in July or so, then we take that on as something that we blame ourselves for. And we're one person in about 8 billion people. We have on an individual scale, we have no part in climate change. But we take it on, and we feel a great sense of shame, and we feel like we should be doing more. And obviously it's a great thing to do what you can, but to have that shame associated with it is so unnecessary. And we're hardly kind of motivating ourselves. Seeing that good news on the effect of however many solar panels that we've installed the last few years as a global society, and what that has done, we're not kind of patting ourselves on the back for that. Because we're not maybe used to patting ourselves on the back. And patting ourselves on the back to some people would be interpreted as kind of getting ready to slack off. So the kind of punishment and the reminding ourselves of the urgency not only is making us anxious, but it's also causing a lot of shame in us, and is putting a lot of pressure on us to work even harder. So we have the anxiety of an impending doom, the shame of being partly responsible for it, even though we're not, on an individual scale, and then the pressure of having to solve it, which we shouldn't even take on, which we shouldn't actually feel the need to take on, because it's not an individual problem. This is where the news and where social media goes wrong, because it takes problems on a societal scale and places the blame and the responsibility for solving it on the individual, on you. Whereas the governments should be solving this. You shouldn't have to kind of take the pressure or take the responsibility or feel the shame associated with it simply because you're living your life. But that's the psychological process that's behind it. So now that I've talked a little bit about the sociological and psychological process behind eco-anxiety, I'm going to go on to talk about practical tips on what you can do to dampen the effects of eco-anxiety. So stay tuned. So let's take a look at what we can do to dampen the impact of eco-anxiety. Here I have two pieces of advice, one being a more long-term piece of advice, and that is to limit your access to news and social media. And this might seem a bit denialistic, but with news, I think we really need to know, or really need to realize, that we are receiving too much information. It used to be that about 30 years ago we'd receive a newspaper maybe once every few days, and we would read about what had happened in the world. Now we are updated every hour or so, or maybe even quicker than that. And we also need to know what information is relevant to us. It used to be that maybe decades and decades ago there'd be local newspapers that we would be reading, whereas now we're receiving information about atrocities that are going on around the world that we feel obviously bad for, because we have empathy and we feel bad for our fellow human beings and what's going on in the world. And then also obviously the news outlets tendency to make headlines negative. They have an interest of sensationalizing news, even though they're also sharing the truth. They're sensationalizing it to a bit, to some extent, and they're also maybe not so interested. The good news wouldn't be the first front page news. It would be a bit lower down on the website. So we are really kind of exposing ourselves to a stream of negative news. So simply by cutting that out, limiting your access, or also choosing your news outlets wisely, you will feel a lot better. And the same goes for social media. Due to the algorithm, we can expose ourselves to a lot of negative information about the environment or what's going on with climate change. If we do happen to watch one video every now and then, a few more videos will pop up and the like. So social media, for a lot of reasons, but also for climate change or eco-anxiety, it can be very good to just limit your access to that, or actually quit it entirely. And then in terms of obviously today I can't really speak English, it seems like, but in terms of the short term, what you can do in the short term to improve your mood, or to dampen the impact of eco-anxiety, is to find something that you have complete control over. Because that is exactly, to some extent, what eco-anxiety is. There's this thing happening to a planet that we're living on that we have very little control over. So just finding something that you have control over and giving yourself over to it, and picking this thing wisely, obviously. I wouldn't really suggest it being maybe online games or something like that, but maybe painting, or kind of pruning a tree. That would be very kind of nice environmental connection there. Having things that you can kind of consume yourself with and be fully in control over. And that would lean into this meditative mindfulness aspect of working with anxiety as well. If you're painting, for example, you can kind of look intently at the strokes that you're making, and you can lose yourself in that, or you can lose yourself in pruning that tree, or you can lose yourself in building that birdhouse, or whatever you choose to do. But the concept of this is to have something that you have full control over and full mastery over, and living in that in the short term will do a lot for dampening the effects of eco-anxiety. So if you feel that eco-anxiety coming up, then you should do those activities. And in the long term, again, you should limit your access to news outlets, choose those news outlets wisely, and also limit your access to social media. That's it for this week's podcast. Before I end, I'm going to announce 3 countries. I've got a map over here, so that's why I'm looking this way. And my 3 countries for this week's therapy world tour are let's see. Poland, Egypt, and Vietnam. So if you're from any of those 3 countries and you're interested in one free online therapy session with me, then go over to wherapy.com, scroll down to the bottom, and you'll find a link to my email address. And there you can just send me a quick email saying that you're interested. Thank you very much for listening to this week's podcast. I hope you are well, and I hope you have a great day. And hopefully I'll see you next week. Thank you very much. Have a great day.